Well, welcome all. Happy Wednesday. It is a delightfully cloudy day here in Austin, Texas. My name is Misty Wild. I'm the COO of Culturati. I do apologize in advance if you hear the pups bark in the background. It's just the pleasure of remote work. It's lovely to see so many of our Culturati members on today. If you're not familiar with Culturati, we are a community of C-suite leaders, investors, scholars, and other executives who get the power of culture and have joined our mission to change the world through the workplace together. We curate thought leadership, host candid conversations around the country, and bring forward the latest research and best practices on organizational culture at our annual summit, which is coming up on April 7th and 8th. Today we have a very special treat, Dr. Molly Sands and Darren Murph, who will give us a sneak preview of their Culturati Summit session, Connective Tissue, What Truly Binds and Bonds a Team. Dr. Molly Sands is the head of the Team Anywhere Lab at Atlassian, which designs evidence-based practices for high-performing distributed teams. She's passionate about using technology to make it easier for people to do meaningful work together. Prior to Atlassian, Molly held leadership positions at Humu and Chadwick Martin Bailey. Her research has been published in top academic journals and featured in the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and in a TED Talk with over 6 million views. Darren Murph, named an Oracle of Remote Work by CNBC and featured in the Forbes Future of Work 50, is a recognized visionary in organizational design. He co-developed case studies at Harvard Business School and INSEAD. Had to make sure of that pronunciation there. He holds a Guinness World Record in publishing and authored GitLab's Remote Playbook and Living the Remote Dream, a guide to seeing the world, setting records, and advancing your career. So without further ado, I will give you over to Dr. Molly Sands and Darren Murph, but one quick piece of housekeeping. At the very end of our session, in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we will break into Q&A, and you'll simply write your questions in the chat, and then they will answer them live. And there we go. Dr. Molly Sands and Darren Murph, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much. We actually have the poll question results. We could start with that. I'm just looking through the answers here. The question again was, what was the most challenging thing about leading a distributed team? It's quite a even mix. The ones that pulled ahead were learning how and when to collaborate asynchronously, connecting and creating a cohesive team environment. And then 32% of you said, I can't pick all of them. So that gives us something to work with. Molly, good to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Look, I know we both are a bit tired of the conversation on where work happens. We want to spend a lot more time focusing on how work happens, and judging by their poll results, it sounds like that's what people want to learn about. I have this thesis that remote work is not a policy, it's a product. And let's start with digging into what that means from your perspective, what you've learned in your career, and how you're experimenting with making work more of a thing you do, less of a place that you go at Atlassian.
Yeah, I love that idea of it, thinking of distributed work as a product. And at Atlassian, we talk a lot about work just happening online, right? It's not really whether there's lots of places we work from. We have offices. I spend some of my time there. We let everyone choose every day. This is our Team Anywhere philosophy, is that flexible work is better. It's a very high trust environment. And I think that's really fantastic for people and lets them do what works best for their work and for their lives. But it's also really changed how we think about designing the ways we work together, and I think pushed us to be a lot more intentional about how we work. And I want to hear more about your thoughts on this too, but I think a lot of your work was really pioneering in this area of remote work lets us change how we come together, how we collaborate, and really shifts that model in a way that helps us be more intentional. And so that's really the model we've taken at Atlassian too, of designing experiences and collaboration mechanisms and even our operations, in thinking of this as a product. And I think it's been really positive for our employees.
It reminds me of a Google study from 2015 where they looked at 5 dynamics of an effective and dynamic team at Google. And one of the layers of that was structure and clarity. Psychological safety was another one, and dependability was another. But what was so interesting about this study is that the first footnote after the study was that the co-location of teammates was not directly tied to the results. And remember, this was well before COVID. And so it's an impressive thing to now look back on that even before we had a lot of systems and tools and infrastructure in place to make this a formalized way of working, it was still true that structure and clarity was key to building connective tissue within teams. And you mentioned a couple of words that stood out to me: trust and intentionality. And when I'm thinking about work as a product, what I look at is what systems are in place at an organizational level that enable people to do their best work. And when I'm looking at the landscape at large and I see companies that are grappling with this, one of the things that I wonder is, well, what infrastructure was the office providing, or a physical space was providing, that they did not have, they didn't have any kind of code, if you will, to fill that gap in the absence of the office as a crutch. And so when I'm advising companies on building infrastructure, what I really look at is project management systems, collaborative tools. Are there pieces in place where people can have a shared reality? Is there equitable access to information, or is the company running in silos? These types of things make remote work or distributed work something that is awesome and you really look forward to, or something that is difficult because the infrastructure that's in place is not really set up to build trust. You can't trust the systems, you can't trust the information. And when individuals across the company and teams don't trust the systems, they don't trust the information that they have access to, then it's hard for people to trust one another.
Yeah, I think you tap into something so key there too, in highlighting that this has been the case for a really long time, right? That this is not purely a change because of the pandemic or because of more remote work, but really these are at the heart of the problems in modern companies. Most of our teams aren't co-located. If you're operating at an enterprise scale, if you're working with customers, collaboration is really happening online and in a lot of different places. And so I think of these in some ways as distributed work challenges, but more so just as the things we need to solve. We need to get really clear about what our goals are. We need to learn to take control of our time and focus on the things that are most important. And we really need to learn more ways to create those cultures of trust and psychological safety. But I think so much of that is driven by the way we share information and the way that we communicate and connect with each other through these different systems and processes too.
I've long maintained that distributed and remote companies are forced to have really great operational rhythms that all companies should have, but because there's no physical space as a crutch, we have to do those things with much more intentionality and much earlier on. And one of the things that you said just struck me a bit funny, which is, in many ways, companies don't get to choose what their identity is. Like, we're an office company, or we're a hybrid company, or we're a remote company. With very few exceptions, most companies from 2024 onward will be distributed to some degree. And if any segment of your company is distributed, it behooves you to build infrastructure to support all of it being distributed, because information has to flow outside of one space. I would even argue that a company with multiple offices in multiple cities, those offices are remote to one another. And so understanding best practices on setting up infrastructure for collaboration to happen, information to be shared across Time zones is useful even for companies that want to identify as we're an office company. And I think that's the conversation that we want companies to really have, is it's not all about where people are. It's about how information is transferred and what systems are in place to ensure that no matter where someone is, they can have access to that information and move work forward.
Yeah, and it really is in part a scale problem, right? Like as you have more people, they can't all be really closely located in the same physical space. And so you need those structures and systems in place. Earlier this year, or I guess it was the end of last year, we did some research with executives at Fortune 500 companies, and we surveyed them asking a lot about how they worked, what the challenges were for their teams. But we asked people about their predictions for the future and whether work was going to become more distributed over the next 10 years. And every single person believed that it would. And this was coming out at a time where there were lots and lots and lots of conversations about going back to the office. But when we talk about distributed as people collaborating across lots of locations and at different times, then pretty universally leaders acknowledge that they think that is the future of work. And I found that so fascinating for thinking about how we solve the right problems for everybody.
A lot of leaders struggle with, well, if infrastructure is the key to all of this, if I should see distributed work as a product or an operating model instead of a policy, where do I begin? Or maybe what are some things that I should stop doing that would help get me on the right track? And to start that conversation, I always harken back to a stat from a Future Forum survey from a few years ago, where they asked people what was important to them. And roughly 80% of people said flexibility in where they work, geography, was important to them. But over 90% responded that flexibility in when they could get work done, so flexibility in time, was important to them. Almost 100% of people wanted flexibility in when work happens. So I think the current frontier of remote work is fascinating, but it's mostly about geography. I think the next frontier of remote and distributed work is much more fascinating. That is the distribution of time. When you can remove the linear function of a day, you can have a non-linear day and still move work forward. That opens up incredible avenues for people and teams to live very different lives and contribute to companies in very different ways. But a lot of really well thought out systems have to be in place to enable that type of time flexibility. And I'm interested in some of the research that you've been doing on what systems do we put in place to give people more flexibility on time. And then I'm happy to share some of the things that I've seen in accomplishing that as well.
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts as well. We've done some really interesting research in how people structure their time at Atlassian recently. So we ran an experiment where we gave people a formula for how to set up their week. And we told them to have no more than 30% of their time, ideally less than that, as meetings that they were pre-planning for. What we think of as like very traditional meetings, right? My team meeting, my one-on-ones, that kind of standing stuff. We told them to have about 20% of their time reflected on their calendar as time they'd be available to collaborate with their colleagues. So more of that bursty, fluid work. You wouldn't necessarily have to hop on a meeting, but you'd respond to messages, or you could, jump in a call and collaborate on something live. And then we told them to split the other half of their week as 30% focus time, so deep, heads down, and about 20% for reactive work, the like answer my emails, respond to my messages, all that kind of stuff that comes in throughout the day, managing that, but to really be clear about when those things were happening. And we found that when we did that, and we asked people to make sure that that reflected their top priorities every day, about 85% of them said they made more progress on their top priorities. About 70% were more clear on their goals. And about 70% of them told us that they had better team communication, which I found really fascinating. Just giving these signals to the people around you about when you are available for what types of work, and even coordinating that within teams, which is something we're, doing more and more now, has been super impactful for the flow of information. Yeah, I can reiterate. So half the time is going to being available, 30% is meetings, 20% is more fluid time that you can work with others, but not a standing meeting. You're around to collaborate. And then we had them split the other half of their individual work time as 30% focus time and 20% collaboration blocks. I'm happy to share. We have this on our work life blog website.
It's fascinating, and I think why that resonates is its clarity, its direction, and it takes the conversation a step further from an esoteric or ambiguous level. Was that for the entire company? Was that at kind of a federal level, or was that more on a team agreement level?
Yeah, so we did this at more of a team agreement level for the research, where we had teams opt in to go ahead and make these changes to their schedule. And we measured what they did. We looked at a lot of different behavioral data to understand how it's working for them. But now it's a practice that we offer to everyone at Atlassian. We're pretty, I'd say we really try to help people find ways that work for them to adapt these things. So it's not a strict, rigid, oh, you're at 35% meetings this week. That's a problem. Maybe that is what you need that week. It's totally fine. But we've offered it more broadly for people to adopt. And overall, we have a culture that's really comfortable with asynchronous work, which is something, let's maybe dive into that next. But I think that's such a key for reducing that meeting time. Got to give people other alternatives for how they communicate and collaborate and share information. And I think in the absence of that, it's actually really hard to ask people to cut back because they are trying to accomplish a goal with the meetings. We're not all like having worthless meetings all the time on purpose. It just ends up that a lot of them feel that way because there are better ways to communicate information, but people don't know them.
There was a key point in there, which is you can't just tell someone to have fewer meetings, but then not give them an alternative way to get work done. And this goes back to our earlier discussion about infrastructure. If you want to move your organization to a place where you're less tied to synchronicity, you want to give people more flexibility in that time. The mandate of not having meetings is a good first step, but everyone is then going to ask, well, where do I get work done? So the best organizations I've seen at this, they choose a system, ideally at a federal level. And you mentioned culture, which generally there are micro cultures within teams, but there's also a federal layer of that culture where you would have a stance on things like asynchronicity. And I've seen organizations take a stance that say we're going to have a bias toward asynchronous work. Now, that doesn't mean all of our work is going to happen through asynchronous means. It just means that we are going to try to lean that way. And we will, of course, switch back to synchronous when it makes the most sense. But tools like Monday.com, ClickUp, these are excellent project management and documentation tools that keep people in the same system. I wouldn't say on the same page, but it at least keeps people in the same system so they know where to go to find information and they know how to collaborate. In a way, a meeting is a very archaic project management tool. It is a way to move work forward, but in the internet era, we have better ways of doing that. And so for companies that are trying to start there with, hey, let's just reduce our meetings, we're having lots of complaints about that. For me, it starts with tooling. Can we give people some sort of alternative? Is there a tool that you already use that you can use in a more comprehensive way? Is this an opportunity to look at what tools are available to get people into a more codified way of thinking? One other thought that I want to mention here is this notion of transparency and documentation. What I have found in studying great distributed teams is there are common threads when it comes to transparency and documentation. I find it difficult to believe that excellent distributed companies can be excellent without having some sort of bent towards we're going to be transparent in as many ways as we can by default. And we are going to lean into documentation. That way we can scale information. We're going to record meetings. We're going to have things written down, and we're going to make time in the system for people to read and ingest that across time zones. What have you seen?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think a lot about this as a behavioral scientist because you can set up your defaults within your systems to encourage transparency. That's very much what we do at Atlassian. One of the company values is open company, no bullshit. And a very Australian value, I would say, from what I've learned working there. But really, we do operate with very high transparency. We use our own products to collaborate. So we use Confluence, Atlas to record and share our goals. Um, and that integrates with all of our task tracking as well. So you can have different levels of Confluence's documentation and information sharing, a much like richer format of that. So if you want to go deeper, and then there's a series of places where people keep shorter updates. But in all of those systems, the default is open calendars, open, and you of course can, block things down or change permissions as needed. But it really has to become an intentional choice to do that because it just takes you a couple of extra clicks. And I think as organizations think about creating more transparency in their systems and operations, those really subtle places where you can introduce a little bit of friction or have the defaults lend towards transparency have huge impacts.
You talked a bit about earlier about making that giving clarity on how people should spend their day at a team level. And what I've seen is that change begins at the team level, or it has the most impact at the team level. What do you advise people that are individual contributors or they're leaders of teams, or maybe they're at a position of higher influence and they want to make an organizational wide change? We want to move something forward. Where do people begin? Is the team level truly the place of highest leverage?
Gosh, I want to hear your answer to this too, because I think it's such a tough one. I really feel like to change in these ways, you have to pair change at the organizational level. Like the right tools and systems have to be available. And hearing repeatedly from leaders that they value high impact, real value creation, that, maker time and strategy and deep thinking is all really important. I think that matters a lot for setting that tone. But in terms of really changing your behaviors within your team, I do think creating space for teams to have some of these conversations and to reflect about how they work and how it could be different or better works well in that group. Because even if you have some of these higher level things in place, what's going to determine if I really write information down is if everyone on my team that I share information with is like, Molly, you held me up for 3 hours today because you're in California and you weren't awake yet and I couldn't find the information. And that's a problem for me. And that is going to have a way bigger impact on me than, anything else, right? If that becomes the expectation and people make it really clear that that's what they want to see and that's what's helping them move work forward at that team level, it changes over time pretty quickly though. And I think those moments matter a lot. What have you seen be really effective for shifting towards this async mindset?
Yeah, what I've seen work really well, and you alluded to this, was having systems that uh, have accountability built in by default. And so when your primary workspace is a collaborative tool like a Confluence, there are systems in place where you get tagged and there are timestamps and there are threaded conversations. It's all very logical and it's all very obvious what the next step should be, or the ball is in this person's court. Whereas if you don't have that system in place, this is all much more ambiguous. Where are we at in the approval chain? Has this person signed off? Are we sure that we have agreement on this part? Do we need to wait for this other team to chime in? Then it becomes a process of just asking people and trying to pick information from each other's brains, which is a much more inefficient way to do it. And so a lot of it just boils down to put systems in place that you don't really have to think about accountability. But I do think there is some tension when you think about the federal level versus the team agreement level. If teams go off on their own and they put systems in place and they have accountability within their own teams, but the cross-functional teams or teams that they work with on a regular basis don't, I guess you got to start somewhere, maybe. And if one team does it, maybe other teams see it and they learn from it. Very interesting. It's a lot easier. You mentioned a company value. It's a lot easier when the company sets the tone and the company sets the value from the top down. But one of the things that we have talked about in preparation of this panel is change management and transformation, and how you get people to embrace doing things differently, even learning how to work asynchronously, moving from a charismatic voice in a room to a thoughtful pen on a document. That's a very different way of thinking, and people, they work different ways and they have different approaches. So how do you get people to upskill? How do you get people to invest time in wanting to do things differently? Even Atlassian has shifted over time, and you're now leaning into nudging people to work in different ways. And there needs to be the mode of learning, but there also needs to be an agreement or a vision of why this is important. And I think where a lot of companies are stuck is if they did not have good vision setting or strategy in place to begin with, demanding that people come back to a certain space seems like the quickest way to get coherence back into the system. What are you seeing there? Like when you are experimenting within Atlassian or talking to other companies, is this strategy or vision thing a thorny topic? Is that where they need to start?
Yeah, it's such a good framing and question. I do think that that vision for what work could be like is really important, and that rallying people behind that matters a lot. And I think that part of that vision for every company really needs to be getting back to deeper work, right? We have such administrative cultures in so many organizations now. Everything is back-to-back meetings and tons of emails and notifications, and I'm responding to stuff and I'm trying to wrangle people so that we can figure out what the work is. And most of our work time can end up going to that, which isn't what anyone wants. And it's also a bad experience for employees. That's exhausting. Being in 30-minute calls for 5 hours straight, it's the worst type of day. And I think a lot of people are very used to it. And what we see this in our data too, when we look at collaboration trends across enterprises, like 80% of people tell you they could be way more productive if they had less meetings. So this is a huge pain point. And when you ask executives what's happening, they don't think a lot of people are doing mission critical work either. They're saying like, yeah, they're doing a lot of stuff, but what is the stuff? And so I think that a big thing that is useful for companies at the leadership level is to focus on their strategy and their vision and get really clear with everyone about what creates value for them. And then I think every team and individual can play an important role in using that information to think about what they're doing that really moves the needle. When I talk with people that feel stuck in teams that are not making a lot of progress, I often tell them, think about the thing you could go to your manager with and say, I can solve this. And you know that if you could solve that problem, they would be thrilled, that that would be a huge win for the team. And maybe it's you and others. It doesn't have to be you in isolation. Teamwork is valuable. But if you can really be concrete about what that is and say what you need to be able to do it, I think it's very rare that any manager or leader is going to say, no, 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 I don't, you can't skip some meetings to create this value that is so clear to us all. And there's a lot to get to the point where know what that thing is, but most people have some pretty good ideas of, here are some ways that I could really change the game for my team or my company. And it's hard to say no to busy work, but when you have something really tangible that you can deliver um, as the alternative, I think that helps a lot. And that really strikes me as fitting well with this model of distributed as a product, really thinking about your work as a product too, and being able to be concrete about the trade-offs, and the trade-offs of like skipping a bunch of synchronous updates versus doing this high value task are very easy to say yes to.
We're speaking at Culturati, so culture comes to mind, and what I've seen be helpful in kind of shifting the mindset or solving the why or getting people galvanized or motivated to embrace different ways of working or just thinking about work differently is starting from the place of respect. What I've seen is that organizations that do this well have systems in place that are known, honored, and respected. When you look at great organizations that are known for various things like pre-reads in Amazon, for example, that is an artifact that is known, it is honored, and it's respected, and it's built into the system. It encourages people to document more because they know that if they do have to meet synchronously, it's baked into the meeting that time will be given, silent time will be given to read. So that way you're not documenting all day and then reading all night and then popping into meetings. You're not overloaded. The system is actually designed to reward you for reading and writing. And so that's an intentional choice. It's a small thing, doesn't require a huge lift, but it has to be done. It has to be known. It has to be honored, and it has to be respected. So you're into behavior, you're into psychology as well. What do you think about that? Where should respect play a role? And should that be something that culture leaders really lean into if they want to change the way people work?
Yeah, I think it is. When I was at Humu, I worked with dozens of enterprises studying their cultures and their people. And really consistently, what we saw was that belonging, trust, and empowerment were these three key concepts that led to places people wanted to work and they wanted to stay for a long time, and where they worked harder and were more productive. And I think about those three elements a lot in the way that we design how we work and how we collaborate together. I know, Darren, we've talked a little bit about this, but how we work is such a key piece of our culture because it communicates what we value, right? If I am really respectful of your time, if I engage with you in ways that, help us both be successful, that matters. If I am thinking about how do I collaborate more effectively, break down some of these silos? Can I be really clear and transparent about my goals? That builds trust with the people around me because I'm showing them what I'm doing and I'm willing to work with them. And that signals in an important way, what that looks like, and sharing information that empowers other people to do their jobs in better ways. And so I think all of those things really are at the key of how we need to be thinking about culture. And flexibility in where you work from too says a lot about how you think about your people and how much you trust them and believe in them, and what you're willing to give to make sure that they're successful.
I do have a thought on that, but I do want to pause and remind folks that we want to hear your questions too. What issues are you specifically facing at your organization or within your teams? So we'll keep an eye out for those in the chat, and we can dive into questions at any time if we see them come in. But back to that earlier point, I do think there's something that you mentioned that made me remember a situation where I was reminded that a lot of these changes are uncomfortable for people. Change is hard. And I think we haven't paused to say that yet, but it probably needs to be said. Change is hard. It's easier to just keep doing the same thing over and over, but the most dangerous words in business are, we've always done it that way. But you have to remind people of that because we are creatures of habit. And when you're mentioning things like, hey, life gets better and easier when you're respectful of people's time, and that means being more transparent with your work and asking for feedback earlier instead of waiting for something to be a perfect product. This makes sense to you and I because we've worked this way for a really long time. But for many people, this is uncomfortable, this is unusual, and it almost feels like they're doing work wrong. What do leaders need to know about the psychology of coaching people through a change this significant that it might feel awkward or incorrect even at first?
Yeah, I always think about really like we probably should have led with that here, right? Change is really hard on people. It feels uncomfortable. I do believe that these ways of working are sort of addictive. Like once you get meaningful stuff done every day, you just can't go back. People at Atlassian talk about this all the time. They're like, I can never go back to meeting culture. It would ruin me. But giving people an opportunity to think of it like an experiment works super well. So if you say some of it is time bound or we're just trying it, it doesn't feel like as huge of a commitment that I have to then do this thing differently forever. So I think a lot about giving people opportunities to try new things in a safe space where they're not feeling like, oh, I could never have, another synchronous meeting. You certainly will. You can, you should. But giving people excuses and sort of jumping off points, and then being really concrete with everyone within your organization about what actions they can take. And I think tying that vision to specific things, I could do as a manager or leader or individual contributor within your company is incredibly powerful for people. How have you approached, or how do you think about this, Darren?
Yeah, I like to take a two-pronged approach. One is experimenting, pilot teams, find a group of people that believe in it and they're okay doing it differently. Ask them to do it differently, but also from a product-based mindset, have retrospectives on it, document what you learned, and then share that far and wide. That's kind of the product mindset. So if you can find your pilot teams, latch onto them, but make sure that they document what they learned, what worked well, what didn't work well, and templatize it as much as possible to share that with other teams in order to encourage them to try it kind of with a lower barrier of entry. So I think that's one approach. But another approach I like is let's just go all the way and see what happens. And you have to find brave organizations that want to do something like that. I mean, even something like a no meeting Friday, maybe that doesn't seem so extreme now, but for companies that are very heavily based in meetings, that's a bit extreme, and it's a forcing function. And I love this term forcing function. Insert forcing functions wherever you can, because you'll learn what happens. You won't really know, can this organization or team transform or change in a dramatic way unless you put forcing functions in there. And so easier said than done, but I think if
Yeah.
you're looking for change, I would go about it two ways. One, find your pilot groups, but then also throw a few things into the system that really act as forcing functions that could, you'll either win or you'll learn. Something will happen that'll be meaningful from it. Also,
Yeah,
so
and I
questions pop up. So yeah, finish that thought, and then we'll bounce over to questions for a couple.
I was just going to say that consistently sharing what you're learning is really, really helpful. I think that's one of the things that gets people on board in a big change like this is being really clear about, hey, we did this differently, and here's what worked, here's what didn't. So I love that point to whether you're doing more of a forcing function approach on one of these things or piloting things with teams, just really finding ways to communicate very broadly within your company about what you learned and how you're iterating on it as you would in any sort of product team is so effective.
I think it's also worth clarifying for folks that are watching that you and I are both speaking from positions of this being someone's job in an organization. And I probably should have said that earlier. That's super important. Imagine being in an organization and you're just asking people across functions, like, how do we drive revenue better? What do we do to improve sales? But yet there's not a revenue leader. There's not a sales leader. You're probably going to struggle with it. Not that you won't make any progress, but probably not as much as having a dedicated leader. And so there is something to be said about having someone who thinks about this and only this, at least a person, if not an entire team, devoted to operations, organizational design. And it's even more important if your company was not born this way, it's not already in the DNA. That's an even bigger burden. And so for culture leaders who are thinking, all right, I understand some of this, but where do I start? It's okay to say, hey, this could or should probably be someone's full-time job. It will certainly be an accelerant if you take that approach.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, so we've got our second and last poll question. We'll give some people time to dive in on that. In the interim, I want to scroll back up. I see a question here from Jenna. How do we break apart silos in a medium-sized agency in a post-COVID world, technology aside? So my guess here is we're talking about how do you culturally, how do you move away from a silo-driven world? So even if technology is in place for transparency to happen amongst work, um, where do we start in breaking down the silos? And I think there's a point in there, which is when you're a distributed company, silos are even more painful than they are if you're in office company, and I agree with that. Any initial thoughts, Molly? Otherwise, I can dive in.
Yeah, we do a couple things that work really well. We have these company-wide hackathons called Ship It that anyone can participate on, where we put small teams together that usually don't know each other and they try to solve a hard problem together, kind of relevant to our question here. And so that works super well for us. We do it in a distributed way. They don't get together in person, but it is a new group of people working on something for 2 days. That's a really fun thing to do. We also have an intentional togetherness gathering program where we bring teams together. We also host regional events. They might go bowling or do a paint night or a happy hour. It really could be anything. And we give teams some ways that they can organize, or people that really doesn't have to be your team, just anyone in your area, that they can organize those. Atlassian also does some of those. I think there's options in that world if you're looking for more of kind of mix and mingle, informal, unstructured time. What else comes to mind for you, Darren?
I would say some teams that are very inspired to share what they've learned can kind of solve this problem for you. If you find your pilot groups that are very good about documenting what they learned and sharing that around, that breaks down silos. But if that's not the case already, I would say lean into your L&D org or person or team, depending on how big the company is. I really think learning and development professionals are kind of at the tip of the spear for this. There's this concept of shadowing. And if you have someone that could even shadow workflows in various teams, it takes the burden off the team, and the person is there as someone who shadows, they are perceptive, they can document, and then their role is to share that around in the organization, essentially make the introductions for you so that the teams doing the work don't have to stop doing the work to do the silo breaking. That could be helpful as well. And shadows can come from anywhere. It really just, the main qualification is someone that's very curious and that's very perceptive and is willing to share. And so I think of it as a bit of an embedded journalist that could roam around the teams, but with the explicit purpose of creating more learning and development and sharing opportunities.
Yeah, I think so much of the silo problem is about the flow of information. So if you can find ways, technology or not, to have people across different functions share information. And sometimes I do think, I know the answer is supposed to be technology aside, but things like Gong or ways that you can record and capture key learnings, or whether that's in a written format or videos or whatnot, key learnings from different functions, and share them across your company. And I think learning and development tends to be a great place to lean in there.
Speaking of learning and sharing, what I love about the poll results that just popped up. So the question again was which of the below makes you feel most connected to your colleagues? We had an overwhelming winner on this one. So almost 3/4 of those in attendance answered working on a hard problem together. And that's a bit of an aha moment for me, which is an idea for breaking down silos is to find really thorny issues in your organization and normalize creating teams to work on them together. So we're going to bring the organization's hardest problems to the widest array of people. That breaks down silos. It creates transparency on what's really happening in the org. And from our cultural leaders here, working on hard problems together makes them feel more connected. So it's cool to see that result.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
All right,
We've
looks like
got another.
what we do. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you. We've got another question from Lauren in the chat. What are your responses when leaders reject distributed work by espousing the power of the serendipity of hallway and lunchroom happenstance conversations they think fuels creativity and success in their organization, even if they have no concrete evidence to prove this?
My response to this is first, I want to disarm the question. So this is I think it's very easy for these conversations to get binary and divisive very quickly. And so even if it's one's opinion that like, look, these serendipitous hallway conversations never lead to anything, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. Like maybe they are useful on occasion. Maybe we romanticize how frequently they happen. Maybe we think they happen more than they do. But look, there are moments in person where intentional in-person moments matter, and I would encourage all teams, especially fully distributed teams, to have an in-person strategy and get people together. But I think the deeper question is, how do we become more intentional about what is called informal communication? And so these hallway conversations or these happenstance moments where you run into someone, this is how you informally communicate. So there was not a formal 30-minute meeting that was set up for information or culture to be conveyed. This was an informal type of interaction. What I have found is that you actually can structure informal communication. You just have to have the right mediums for this to happen. One easy way to do this is if you use Slack or Teams, start to curate and create community channels where people can jump into non-work channels on topics that matter to them. For example, a parenting Slack channel or a cooking Slack channel or video games or music making or you name it, anything where people could gather around something that matters to them. And why it's important for it to be non-work related is it allows people to be their real selves. And honestly, where these hallway conversations really start is people engaging on an informal level that ends up evolving into something work related. But in a distributed setting, you have to create these pathways for people to just be humans together. Because if they're only doing work together all the time, it tends to squash the innovation. But if you give them pathways to be humans together, even if it's something like a parenting channel and you're sharing information on how do you get a 6-year-old to put their pants on in the morning because mine just won't do it, whatever the
I would
case may
love to know that.
be. Yeah, right. But these are the kinds of things that you can actually engineer. And this is a simple way. It doesn't require a new tool or new IT buy-in. This is using tools you already have. It's a simple approach to create an environment where humans can be humans. And that's really where it starts.
Yeah, and I think what you said there, Darren, about sort of finding that common ground in the beginning of these conversations is so helpful. I always try to connect on the fact that, yeah, we do think that it's so important to have close relationships at work, or we're on the same page that this thing matters. And then it really is a conversation about how we get there. And there's lots of alternatives that are not bringing people together for these magical feedback sessions over the water cooler.
Shaquille had a question. Why are so many large companies compelled to bring employees back to the office? Some companies have even announced that distributed employees may not be considered for promotions, et cetera. I can start with this one. I think it really comes down to two things: trust and strategy. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but we can dig in a bit. One is that it really requires a deep vision and a deep strategy on what you want the future of work to look like at your organization in order to put together a really solid plan on what tools are we going to embrace and how are we going to upskill our employee base to be able to use those tools. How do we make sure that they are known, honored, and respected? That is a strategy unto itself. And so for organizations that have been in this state of chaos for 3+ years, and they're just desperate for something that feels like coherence, this is quintessential human psychology. You can only stay in a state of chaos for so long before you start grasping for coherence, even if it's not the best thing for you. You have to have that coherence. I think a lot of companies are at that point where they have to get back to some sort of normalcy, some state of coherence, even if they know that it's probably not the most progressive or even logical or beneficial approach. And so the organizations that kind of need to embrace this the most perhaps are the least set up to do that because they weren't great at strategy and vision to begin with, and certainly not on something as ancillary to their business as an operating model or an organizational design.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Beautifully said.
Looks like we've got one other question from Nick. Follow up on the distributed work question. By the way, thanks for the questions, group. These are great.
Yeah.
Organizations think about management training in a hybrid and remote culture. It seems like having, quote, good managers remains a struggle for most organizations. And in the new normal of workplace structures, bad management behaviors are even more glaring. Spun differently, it takes intentionality to be a good manager in a hybrid or remote environment. So, to what extent are there good examples for how orgs can incorporate these new dynamic leadership development techniques? I'm guessing Atlassian has done some research on this. I don't know how much of it you've published, but if there's anything that comes to mind, I'm sure Nick and others would be interested in knowing.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of research on this right now. I would say a couple things come to mind for me immediately. One is really helping make sure managers are connecting with their team members at a regular cadence, giving them guidance about what to connect on. We have some new stuff coming out about that soon, so I'll look forward to sharing more of that with you all at Culturati as well. But really helping people build their networks in organizations is important too. And I think that that's something that we can do in an intentional way through, mentorship opportunities and we have slightly larger teams at Atlassian than some organizations. That gives you more senior folks within your team that can help support you as well. I also think upskilling managers about clarity in goals is really important. If I could train them on one thing, it would be how to set clear goals with their teams. That matters a lot and is really, I would argue again, very important wherever you work, right? If you're in an office, you still need to know what work is important. But if you aren't spending as much time around other people, maybe not capturing that, you should really think about helping managers bring that clarity. Um, and sometimes training can be a good opportunity to bring people together too. So we do think about having some synchronous training moments where managers maybe hop into a live training event or even might travel somewhere to do some of this upskilling and learning. And that can be a really beneficial way to get people together, help them build those connections, and upskill them in these ways too.
My tip here is a super tactical takeaway that hopefully you could implement today. It's equipping all managers with this one question: what does success look like? And you mentioned this, Molly, get really clear on what your goals are, what's important, what's not important. But it is astounding to me how much alignment can come from just asking. The manager asks the report asks the manager, hey, what does success look like? Let's write it down. And if both people can codify and agree that that's what success looks like, you're more than halfway there. And this goes back to the vision and strategy problem where a lot of companies, they don't have great answers to that, believe it or not. But it is a good forcing function to any manager report relationship to just put that question in the center of it and wrestle with it until until you find an answer to it.
Yeah, and that tends to be a good one where you can implement it into a process too, right? There's often a lot of processes around manager and their direct report conversations, cadence, performance evaluations, all that stuff. There's places there where I think you can make this stuff really, really clear.
I know we're coming up on time, so I want to wrap with two questions. And I want you to go first, and then I'll go. One is, why does this matter to you? What kind of improvements or quality of life improvements have you seen by embracing this and learning more about working in new ways and working across distributed teams? And then lastly, if leaders are going to leave with one thing that they could go take back to their teams today, what would you give them?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so how has this changed my life? So I live in San Francisco in like a major metropolitan area, and I moved here because I got a job here. And I had to move my family because that was the way that I could take the job. And I had a great experience. I loved doing that job. It was wonderful in so many ways, but I can't do that over and over and over again. It's not the right life choice for me. And so having more flexibility in where you can live, where you can spend time is huge. I've got people I love all over the world, and I actually get to go spend time with them for significant periods of time and live where I want to live. And that's been huge for me. And I don't have to uproot my whole family often to get those things. And that is really amazing. So I would say that's the biggest life thing for me. The tip I would give everyone, you know, for at the end of my day, every single day now, I spend like 5 to 10 minutes thinking about what is the one thing I have to accomplish tomorrow. Like if I am going to have a really big success where I feel great when I log off, what is that? And then I look at my calendar and I actually do look at it and I look at what's on it and I'm like, do these things match? Sometimes the thing is I need to spend time with my team and support them and make sure they're clear. And then I have a ton of meetings and that's totally fine. There are other days where I look at that and I'm like, I need to develop a strategy page on this. And there's not a long block of writing. So that's not a good fit. And then I change it. And so I really think about calendar as time management tool, not as a meeting scheduler. And that would be my tip.
Great tip. For me, I'm an adoptive father. So just over 5 years ago, my wife and I adopted our son at birth. And I look back at our adoption journey, and it was really so seamless compared to what a lot of people go through in this journey. And when I ask why, a lot of it is I had a flexible work schedule, I had a flexible team, and I could be where I needed to be in that journey. And now that I'm in this adoption community, I see the need. And I think if we can build tools and systems to empower tens of millions of knowledge workers globally to have more control over their time, how many of them are going to use that repurposed time to impact change for something that matters to them? For some, that would be fostering and adopting. There could be any number of other things that they could repurpose this time to. And I just envision a better world, a healthier world when people have more control of their time and they're able to repurpose it. So that's mine. The tip that I would give people is, hey, let's get rid of Zoom happy hours, and I'm going to give you an alternative. It's called the Community Impact Outing. So what you do is you tell everyone on your team that the hour they were going to spend in the Zoom happy hour, and now they can take that hour anytime during the week. And what they're supposed to do is go do something life-giving. So if you're in the adoption community, maybe that's spending time at an orphanage. Maybe that's building homes for Habitat for Humanity. Maybe that's just going and spending time with your neighbor that you don't spend enough time getting to know because you're in back-to-back meetings. Whatever the case may be, all that it requires is it to be life-giving. But also, you have to take a selfie of yourself while you're there and share it back with your team and watch the connections that are built. You would be amazed what community could be built from just sharing what you do in everyday life. And so this is a much better approach than a Zoom happy hour. Same sunk cost. You can implement it next week. And so I hope some of you do and report back. And I know there were some questions that we did not get to, but come see us at Culturati, and you can find both of us on LinkedIn as well. Thanks all for joining. Molly, thanks for being here. Culturati team, thanks for setting this up.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy days. We will be sharing this recording, any links mentioned, as well as the Q&A, including those two that we didn't get to, tomorrow or Friday. So thank you all and have a wonderful Wednesday.